Good afternoon, and welcome to chapter 3 in this series of videos on the social and cultural changes in the United Kingdom in the 1970s. So the aim being to explore what would it mean to write a cultural history of the 1970s, or to think about it in that way. And in this part of the videos, and much less in the live classes, in the videos I'm going through a chronology, a timeline, and looking at some significant moments, which opens up the question of how do you choose which moments are more significant than others? Well, I get to choose myself, and we're all up to September in 1970. And September 1970, apart from being the month when the first Glastonbury Festival was organised, it was also the month that this album was released. Now, this had been a stage show, Jesus Christ Superstar, by young but soon to be renowned producers of musicals, Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice. Now you can see them at the bottom right. And it was extremely successful album and show. The album more than the show, because the shows are very expensive to go to. And I would say that what was interesting about this is that it was a very ambitious attempt to use the Bible story, the gospel story, as entertainment, which again might be considered to be less likely 20 years earlier when England was a more religious place. Although remember that even today, Britain has an established church. There is no formal separation of church and state, and indeed the Church of England bishops even today sit in the House of Lords. That is, that they take part in the revision of laws and the checking of laws before they are pushed through. In any case, to get back to Jesus Christ Superstar, it had two particular characteristics, apart from being of a very good quality. First of all, it attempted to some extent to put the story of Jesus in a political context. And so Judas was portrayed as betraying Jesus, not because of being evil or anything like that, but because he wanted Jesus to do something differently, that he wanted Jesus to be a political leader and throw off the yoke of Rome so that the Jewish people could be free of Rome. Now, of course, there was quite a lot of interpretation about this, but that was one interesting side of Jesus Christ Superstar. The other side is the end. Because Jesus Christ Superstar, although it's very respectful to religion in many ways, it ends when Jesus Christ dies. Now, of course, if you're a Christian, then that's not the end. That's the whole point. The whole point of the story is that it doesn't end when Jesus Christ dies. And so this was fairly controversial. It was fairly controversial. I remember I was in the Catholic primary school at the time, and some of my friends were were quite hostile to this in this sort of way that you can be when you're a 10-year-old. Staying with religion, just a month later, we have an international event, really, where Pope Paul VI, and the Pope at the time, canonized the 40 martyrs of England and Wales. And I know that in France, when you have martyrs, they tend to be from the 3rd century or the 4th century, when the Romans did them in. In Britain, most martyrs, whether they are on the Protestant side or on the Catholic side, came from the whole period of the Reformation, that under Queen Mary, who was a Catholic, a whole series of Protestants were burnt at the stake. And under Elizabeth, who established the new compromise, which meant that the Anglican Church was, as we say, a broad church, killed a series of Catholics who are very well known in the Catholic community in Britain. So John Southworth and somebody Barlow and Margaret somebody, I can't remember them all, and we were taught them at school. And in October 1970, so quite recently, Pope Paul decided that these 40 Catholics who were killed for their faith would be saints. Now, the Catholic population of the United Kingdom was about 10% at the time, and had remained this for quite a long time, although a higher percentage in Northern Ireland and a higher percentage in Scotland than in England and Wales. This is still a time when the 10% of Catholics almost all go to separate Catholic schools, which are not private schools, which are state-funded schools, but separate. And this was the English compromise, if you like, about religious education, that all schools have religion in them. Sometimes a fairly generic religion to please any believers who happen to be there. Sometimes Protestant and sometimes Catholic, and that's still the case today. 1970, November 1970 is the time when the Sun newspaper, a very popular newspaper, published for the first time a photo of a semi-naked woman on page 3 of the newspaper, and subsequently did so every day for many years. Now, this is perhaps a detail, but this is a newspaper that sold millions of copies, so perhaps it's not a detail. It's a cultural change which reflected two changes. First of all, a less Puritan view of nudity, which had been a gradually loosening up over the previous 20 years. 1968, the end of censorship in the theatre, for example, and the very beginning of the 1960s, the publication of the full text of D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover. On the other hand, and particularly noticeable in the 1970s, the practice of printing a photograph of a semi-naked woman in a daily newspaper, which was there to be read on the bus, or was considered, certainly in feminist circles and in women's liberation circles, to be reducing women to the status of sexual objects. And indeed, this was eventually won because a few years ago, the Sun finally stopped producing these. The very first Gay Liberation Front demonstration was in 1970. Now, I couldn't find a photograph of it, and this is a photograph from 2 years later. It was very, very significant, partly inspired by movements in the United States. And if you look at this, you can see the different banners, and you can see the campaign for homosexual equality. And that's probably the Bristol group, which we can read behind there, and the London women's group. Yes, so you can see there's local groups involved. You also see a noticeable absence of banners from left-wing political parties. Very slowly during the 1970s, the left-wing parties began to take on board the idea that defending homosexual rights was part of being on the left. This had been the case before, in fact, back at the beginning of the 20th century, and certainly in the Russian Revolution. Defending homosexuals was quite common, and indeed the Russian Revolution was the first. Russia was the first country in the world to decriminalize, to treat homosexual partnerships in the same way as they treated heterosexual marriages. But Stalin turned all that back to front and went back to the old way of encouraging large families and repressing homosexuals. So, but in any case, by the 1970s, really there were not many left-wing organizations very interested in defending homosexual rights. That will happen during the 70s, little by little during the 70s, and will be definitively gained in the 80s, partly because of the terrible AIDS epidemic, which allowed which made people think more carefully about the question, certainly. And I've already said something about this in class, so I won't give any more from this. In any case, attitudes slowly improved during the 70s, but homophobia remained extremely common. And when in 1978, the Tom Robinson Band released the single "Sing If You're Glad to Be Gay," which encouraged the whole audience to sing along, either because they were gay or imagining themselves to be gay, which is something very highly empathetic. Tom Robinson was expecting a very hostile reaction to this song. And in fact found a lot more sympathy than he thought. There's a very well-known episode when he does a concert in a prison, and he's expecting the male prisoners to be not very sympathetic. And in fact, he found quite a large amount of sympathy. So the whole question of how who was privately sympathetic to homosexuals and who was not is a very complicated one, because it was something that people were likely to hide. December 1970, then the end of the decade, the breakup of the Beatles, first announced the previous April, as you can see here. Now, how important is that as cultural history? It established the tradition of groups breaking up and getting back together, and breaking up and getting back together. The Beatles were one of the early groups who were a complete group. That is, that they wrote their songs and they played their songs, and they saw themselves as artists, and were expected to produce something new on every album and not the same thing every time. And so certainly, although obviously the breakup of the Beatles has a certain anecdotal side to it, the increasing seriousness with which popular music is taken by the population and elsewhere is certainly very important. November was one of the moments of the fight against racism, which was particularly important. And I don't know if you can see it in Britain, but sorry, I don't know if you can see it in France. But there's very recently a series of films been brought out about the struggles of the Black population in Britain, and there's a whole episode of the Mangrove Nine. And now the Mangrove Nine, if I remember correctly, the Mangrove was a bar, a West Indian bar, which was persecuted by the police, and at a particular moment there's a fight back, and in this process a series of Black people are arrested and taken to and imprisoned, and there's a very well-known trial about that. So this is one of the significant moments when the relations between police and Black people come to the fore. To finish the year, I wanted to look at a couple of books which were first published in 1970, and these are. There were fewer books published in the 1970s than there are today, but even today, I think there are certain books every year which seem to have quite a wide influence. Now, not necessarily because everybody's read them, but because if they haven't read them, they've heard about them on the television or somebody's talking about them, and so on. And here are two of them. Now, both of them published outside the UK, but which had a significant influence on the radical movements or the radical sympathies of the 1970s. On the left, you can see there Paulo Freire's book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and which was first published in Portuguese. I have a little more information on this if I look through it. Oh, there you go. The point of this is that Freire insisted on the necessity for education to start from the point of view of the learners. No pedagogy which is truly liberating, he wrote, can remain distant from the oppressed. By treating them as unfortunates and by presenting for their emulation models from among the oppressors. The oppressors must be, the oppressed must be their own example in the struggle for their redemption. So this is a whole idea of that there are new ways of learning. Now, he was originally talking about South America, but it will have a certain influence across the world in some of the new pedagogies that are put forward, and a tremendous influence in the Black consciousness movement in South Africa, because South Africa under apartheid at this time was very much suffering from the established school system. In particular, there was a huge conflict when the Black children were obliged to use only Afrikaans in schools, which was not their language, which was the white man's language, if you like. And so the Black consciousness movement, which was established, was very 1970s, although it probably began in the 60s, I'm not quite sure, in that put emphasis on the importance of oppressed people better understanding and changing their own attitude to themselves. The other book, very influential from 1970, is a feminist a foundation feminist book, The Female Eunuch by German Greer. German Greer is still around today, and has written more controversial stuff recently on another subject. And Greer insists that the ideal Western family, mother and father and 2.4 children, has very negative effects on the vitality of the women in it. And this is why she suggests that women in traditional families are being pushed to be like eunuchs, ignoring their own vitality, whether sexual or otherwise, and are simply I can quote from it, like beasts, for example, who are castrated in farming in order to serve their master's ulterior motives, to be fattened and made docile. In this way, women have been cut off from their capacity for action. So that's not from the book, that's from an interview that she made about the book. What happens to women, she says, is a process which sacrifices vigor for delicacy and succulence, and it is one that has got to be changed. So you can see that this is one of a series of books which had a very wide and ambitious idea of what needed changing for women. So it was quite different in a way from some of the movements, perhaps in the campaigns, perhaps in the 50s and 60s, which were about changes, better pay for women and so on, but which were not really about revolutionizing the position of women. This is also in 1970, the Complete New English Bible was published, a new translation of the Bible, which only actually lasted to 20 years. But I don't think I'll go into that because I don't think it's perhaps quite as important. Another first published in 1970, tremendously important, this magazine, The Ecologist. So this is the first time you have an ecological magazine produced regularly. I think it was a monthly at first. And that's tremendously important because if you're going to have a lasting political movement, you absolutely must have a publication. Otherwise, you just don't really exist. And by the front page, you can see that there was a certain tendency to be very dramatic, and some might say melodramatic. So you have a series of questions opened up here. First of all, population control for Britain. Now, this was a big debate in the 1970s about, are there too many people in the world? And are there too many people in Britain? Yes, and so I think today this idea is less popular because there was certainly a certain, I'm not talking about the ecologists, but there was a certain number of people in the 1970s who were saying in 20 or 30 years, the population will go up so fast that it will be a terrible disaster. And as we know, that didn't happen. And in fact, it seemed that as some middle countries, not the poorest countries, but not the richest countries, as some middle countries stabilized with somewhat less poverty, then women and men decided to have fewer children. And so, in fact, we found that the birth rate tended to fall, so that the population is not exploding as many people thought it would be. Notice we also have, is there a peaceful atom? Yes, the question of nuclear energy. Perhaps surprising to see that. I suspect that inside the magazine the answer is no, and certainly nuclear energy became rather unpopular in Britain from the 70s on, more so than in France, but this may be partly because Britain was not so dependent on it. And finally, can we avoid a world famine? So here you can see then a rather what's the word? A rather dramatic idea, a world famine. We know that there wasn't a world famine, but this is this kind of catastrophe which some people were suggested was going to happen. However, at the beginning, the Ecologist magazine had a small circulation, mostly of scientists, and the tone did tend to be more catastrophist than later environmental magazines. So we're going to move on to 1971 in just a moment. I'll be with you in just one moment. 1971. Then let's see what cultural and social changes in 1971 might be worth talking about. Well, in January, then a law which was passed in 1969 actually came into effect. You know, there's often a certain delay between a law being passed and it coming into effect. And this was the Divorce Reform Act, which made it easier for people to get a divorce. And I will have a little bit more to say about that in a moment. But first of all, I have some statistics from 1971. In 1971, 47% of babies were born to mothers under the age of 25. In 2008, it was half as many. So you can see that young mothers were very much something from the 70s and much rarer in the 21st century. In 1971, the proportion of households made up of only one person was 17%. And by the year 2000, it was 32%. This is more and more people living to be older and living on their own. Housing conditions continued to improve. Housing conditions had been improving gradually for 20 years. It takes a long time for housing conditions to improve because sometimes it's a matter of passing laws which institute new rules for new buildings, but don't necessarily change the old buildings. In 1971, 11.4% of people still had no toilet inside. The toilet was at the end of the garden. By 2011, this was 0.3%, of that had practically disappeared. I mean, certainly my grandmother had an outdoor toilet in the 1970s. In 1971, there were 600,000 young people in higher education, essentially universities. By 2007, there would be 2.5 million. So 4 times as many university students in 2007 as there were in 1971. So this is a huge societal change based on the need for the economy to have more educated people. Partly to be able to adapt to new technology as it comes along, and partly, well, yes, in generally to be more adaptable. Certainly they would want, and this transformed the education system in a whole series of ways, some of which I'll be talking about in a moment. In 1971, 6.5 million holidays abroad were bought by British people. Now, this would involve fewer than 6.5 million people, since a minority would have taken 2 or more. In 2008, there were 8 times more. Yeah, so it's certainly true in the 1970s in the working class. If somebody went on holiday to Spain, they would come home and tell all their neighbors and their friends, "I went on holiday to Spain." This would be a sign of prestige. And as the years went on, people got much more difficult, of course. And today, even working class people will sometimes go a very long way away on holiday. My brother went to Thailand last year, whereas in the 1970s, this was the beginning of the foreign holiday. And this included the production of perhaps not very good pop songs like Viva España, this year I'm off to sunny Spain. So a pop song for everybody to sing along, I'm going to Spain on holiday, which obviously today will not make a pop song because there's nothing surprising about. This is very similar to the pop songs they made 100 years ago in 1910 about I've got a pocket camera. Because whatever's new can sometimes be given into pop songs. So to get back to the Divorce Act, from now on, after the 1969 Act came into effect, couples might divorce if they had been separated for 2 years, or 5 years if one of them did not want a divorce. And a divorce could be granted without either partner needing to prove a fault. So this is part of a very long process, which we've already seen in the decriminalization of homosexuality, the abolition of censorship, and so on. A very long process by which the state and the government renounces the idea that they should intervene very much in people's personal and moral lives. That it becomes much more accepted that it's an individual question. You get divorced, and it's your problem and your partner's problem. It's not part of encouraging moral decline or anything like that. And this will also be one of the reasons, not the only one of the reasons for the legalization of abortion in the 1960s. In education again, January 1971, you get the beginning of TV broadcast by the Open University. Now, the Open University was established by the Harold Wilson Labour government in the 1960s, and indeed Harold Wilson once famously said that it was the political act that he had done which he was most proud of. The Open University was aimed, and it's some work by correspondence, some work by television, some work by holiday summer schools, and it was to allow people who had not been to university, that is the vast majority of the population, because only 600,000 students were in higher education. It would allow people who had not gone to university to pass a degree anywhere, anyway. And the Open University, when it opened, immediately attracted a large number of professors and lecturers who believed in this idea of mass education. So this is the idea that the more people are educated, the better. And so it's moving away from the idea that most people cannot be educated. Now, that's not my idea, of course, but the very common idea among the elite in the 40s was, well, really, most of the people, we just want them to be educated enough to become road sweepers or factory workers. We don't need to educate them. It's not important. So this is partly a rise of the democratic spirit and a valorization of ordinary people and what they can learn. Certainly a large number of housewives in particular, and women who were staying at home with the children, would make the most of the Open University. In February 1971, there is a change, which is perhaps a detail, was of the decimalization. That is, that the United Kingdom changed its cash, its currency, before February 1971, before the 15th of February 1971, D-Day. There had been 20 shillings in a pound and 12 pence in a shilling, and decimalization meant there were now 100 new pence in a pound. So this is a metric system. And the introduction of the metric system in other domains, in particular weights and measures, was very gradual and not always welcome. And many aspects of British life today are still measured in imperial units. People weigh 10 stone. You can buy wood. You buy wood which is 3 by 4, 3 inches by 4 inches, and you drink pints of beer. So there's a whole areas which have not been taken over by metric, but metric has taken over very much in industry. I think my favorite example is wood. If you buy wood for building something in your living room, you buy it. You measure the width and the depth in inches and the length in meters. So you say, I'd like to have 3 meters of 3 by 4, please. 3 meters by 3 inches by 4 inches. It's poetic. It's different. And that gets me to half an hour. So I will be back soon with chapter 4. I'm just preparing the slideshow for it. Thank you for listening, and goodbye for now.